welcome. My name is Brenda Reyes-Lua, and I serve as the Assistant Director for the Center for Public Service. And we are very excited to have Antonio Ortega joining us from Cuernavaca, Mexico, for our second day in our series of storytelling for social change. And his session is titled Queer History in Latin America, Navigating Through Machismo Culture, Dictatorships, and Catholicism. And this is all as part of Gettysburg College J-term offerings. Before we dive into our discussion, please know that we are recording this session. We will have an opportunity for question and answer at the end of our presentation, but please feel free to add questions in the chat at any time. And I would like to welcome Carly, who serves as our AmeriCorps Vista member at the college, and she will formally introduce Antonio.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining this session. I know it's during break, so we appreciate you being here. I am so excited to introduce Antonio Ortega, who is joining us, like Brenda said, from the beautiful city of Cuernavaca, which is about 2 hours south of Mexico City. Cuernavaca is also where I got to learn from Antonio during my semester abroad when I was an undergrad. I met him through Augsburg College's Center for Global Education and Experience, where he's worked since 2003. Before that, he promoted Sexuality Alternative Spanish School and coordinated their Gay and Lesbian Studies program. Antonio has a master's in history and is a doctoral student also in history at El Colegio de Morelos in Cuernavaca, where he is researching the history of queer movements in Cuernavaca. He is also the founder and active member of Grupo C de Cuatro, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting AIDS through sexual education, where he even dressed up as a huge condom. He has been with his husband, Eduardo, now for almost 3 decades and married him in 2014 when a full same-sex marriage law passed in Mexico City. Through his personal experience as an activist, educator, and student, Antonio is well suited to discuss the complexities of queer history in Latin America. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand it over to him.
Gracias, Carly. It's good to see you, and thanks for all the praise. And so I want to start by thanking Gettysburg University. I've been to your beautiful campus a couple of times with students from that college. And I want to thank my new friend, Brenda Reyes-Lua, who we have a Mexico connection, and also Jeff Ryu, who's the director for the Center for Public Service. I think it's wonderful that you do this kind of events. And also my colleague, Peggy Johnson, who was the link and organizer of all this. So like Carly said, I'm going to do an explanation, maybe 30 to 40 minutes. I have a PowerPoint with images so that you get to see pictures and dates, etc. And then if you have any questions, you can type them. And at the end, I'm open, of course, to answer whatever I know. I mean, I'm not the super expert. But what I can tell you, as I've taught a course, Queer History in Latin America, for 2 terms already. So I'm learning little by little. So if there's no more comments or questions, I'm going to share my screen. And a PowerPoint on queer history. And let's see. Okay, so can people see it there? Okay, so this presentation, I gave it a thought, and I thought, queer history in Latin America, what are the challenges? So the challenges are machismo, a machismo culture that's still very rooted, dictatorships, military regimes, and Catholicism. So a very different reality than the US. I wouldn't say there's not machismo in the US, there is, but I would say it's not as in Latin America, and we'll talk about it in a moment. You haven't had military regimes or dictatorships, which are very repressive, and you have more religious diversity, although some are not very open to these issues, but some are, no? And so, like Carly said, I work for Augsburg University based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but they have a campus in Cuernavaca for 40 years, basically because of liberation theology. I'll talk about this when I get to the 1960s. but Cuernavaca is one of the capitals of liberation theology. Is that why the college started a campus there? This year we celebrated our 40th anniversary, and we had a big party. It was great. The president came, and then a month later we closed the campus due to the pandemic. So it was a little unfortunate. And I have a map here about LGBT friendliness in Latin America. So green means more friendly and red less. So I'm going to give my presentation. At the end, I'm going to go to the same map, and then we'll sort of debrief it. So I'm going to start this presentation by going way, way back to before when the Europeans came here. So in pre-Hispanic America or pre-Columbian America, many cultures existed here, and we know that they have very different views on gender and sexuality, but also on religion and on many, many, many issues. But our theme today is more like gender and sexuality. So some examples are, for example, women had more participation as healers, as priestesses, even as prostitutes. In Europe, or at least in Spain, which is our mother country, women were more oppressed and didn't have much public participation. Same-sex relationships were accepted in some of these cultures. The relations were not that seen, and we do know they were comfortable showing their bodies because of the way they dressed, and they still dress some of the dancers, for example, or warriors or whatever. So this map of the Americas shows the main cultures, which are the Aztecs and the Mayas in this central part that's called Mesoamerica, middle of America. But in that area, Mesoamerica, there were more than 60 cultures, and those cultures spoke more than 60 languages. So those languages have survived, interestingly. In the South of America, we have the Inca culture, and the Inca culture also was very, very rich culturally. The things that were different were their diet was corn, whereas their diet was potatoes. So you know this. They're not from Europe, they're from South America. But they had a very different, very similar cosmovision. They believed in many gods, and we'll talk about a little more details in a moment. Okay, so then how do we know that they had a different view on gender and sexuality? Well, one are testimonies by the Spaniards, all these chronicles of the conquest of the New World. Also, we have codes, but very few have survived. The Spanish destroyed them, which is so sad because me as a historian, they have such a value, but yeah, they didn't find no value in it. They destroyed them. And also through art, here we have some ceramic figures from Peru, from the Inca culture, and you can see how they portray naked bodies, female genitalia, male genitalia, copulation in different positions, breastfeeding. So it's quite amazing. Sadly, the Spanish found this offensive and of course a sin, whatever. So they destroyed most of the ceramic. But this man called Larco started collecting it, and you can now see a collection of all this ceramic in this museum, and it has a virtual tour. So if you go to this website, Museo Larco, you should see the erotic room, which, I don't know, it's a controversial title because that's our Western point of view. Of course, maybe they didn't find it erotic, but that's how it's called, and it's quite an interesting website to visit. So in 1492, as you know, America is discovered, and that's a lot of discussion going on. This who discovered who, and they're even destroying statues of Christopher Columbus. But well, the fact is that the Europeans arrived in 1492. Right here, you can see one of the first maps. You can see really that it's America. That's the name they gave. And then 2 years later, they sit down, Portugal, Spain, and the Pope, and they do this called the Tordesillas Treaty that divides the new land between Spain and Portugal, because Spain had financed the expedition, so they got the biggest chunk. Whether you know it or not, Spain owned from Alaska to Patagonia. If you ever go to Alaska, you'll see towns that are called Córdoba, Valdez, and you wonder, why do they have Spanish names? Well, the Spanish crown's domains went all the way down there. Portugal got a little piece, but it's not that little. Brazil is one of the biggest countries in the Americas, so it's in light green. And they also decided that the natives of these new discovered lands had no soul until the 1550s. So then the conquest started, and the conquest was not only of the land, but it was also of the bodies. And it is said that the conquest happened with the sword and the cross. And I would say more with the sword, so a war. A terrible war, because they also brought gunpowder, they also brought diseases, they enslaved the Indians, so it was basically a genocide. There's a wonderful book that's called The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The first chapter is about the natives of the Americas, and it's really, really heartbreaking if you like history and want to explore more. And so then they imposed Catholicism in all these new continents. So the new concepts like sin, sodomy, shame of the body, etc., to name a few. No, here you can see on the first image right here. These are called the tapadas limeñas. So women in Lima, they had to have a veil, and so imagine after being showing your body, etc., then you had to dress like this. The new concept of the deadly sins, and sodomy, as you will see in a moment, was severely punished. There is this drawing, 1513, in, I think it's in Panama, where they throw sodomites to hungry dogs for them to kill them. So you can see the new message. Okay, so then in the 1500s, it's the beginning of 3 centuries of colonialism. And how did the European powers justify this? Well, because they were pagans, they believed in many gods, goddesses, female gods, male gods. They were sodomites, they were people of color, they were uncivilized, they practiced human sacrifices, etc. And they imposed also white superiority and male superiority. So all our founding fathers were men. They all came, all the ships had men, and not very nice men, because a lot of them were convicts, They took them away from prisons and they sent them to the Americas. If the ship sank, valuable lives would be lost. Friars or priests, military, and convicts. So again, our founding fathers were not very nice people, and all the European powers immediately distributed the world, so not only America, but Africa, Asia, etc. And you can see the British domain was like 1/4 of the world. Spain had a lot, one of the superpowers of that time, Portugal, etc. You can see colonial came to oppress the native people. So then in the previous image, I talked about that the Hispanic cultures practice human sacrifices. But there's a mural here in Morelos of Diego Rivera that on one hand has the human sacrifices and the other the Inquisition. And so it's interesting to discuss what was more brutal or more violent, the sacrifices or the Inquisition, that after a trial you were condemned to be burned at the stake. And so Inquisition was imposed all over America, Catholic America, to impose Catholicism. And there were many reasons for you to be taken to the Inquisition trial and to be burned at the stake if you didn't renounce your beliefs, if you practice witchery, again, if you practice sodomy, etc. So there were many, many, many reasons. So hundreds of sodomites in the Americas were born at the stake. And why? Because sodomy was a terrible, terrible sin. It was not only a sin, it was a triple sin, because it was against yourself, it was against your brother, and it was against God, no? And in the research I have done, just here in New Spain, which later became Mexico, in the years of the Inquisition, I found that at least 100 sodomites were punished with fire. And I found this through 37 cases in the National Archives in Mexico City. So there's 37 cases, but of course, each case, it's not one person, because to practice, you need to practice with somebody else, right? So there's cases of 2, but there's cases of 14, they start torturing the guys, and who did you have sex with, and they start naming all these people. And so there's cases even of 14 people. So the church was the one taking care of this issue. And first they did castration, and later they did burning people at the stake, basically to get rid of them, because with castration, you wouldn't eliminate the person, And so it was infectious, contagious, etc. So in the colonial period, I know mostly of cases of men, of sodomites, but there was mostly invisibility of lesbians and of trans people. But I have found interesting cases. For example, the case of a woman, Felipa da Souza, who was burned at the stake for loving a woman in Brazil. So her case is quite interesting because she never denied it. So she always said, no, I love women, and I don't know if she said it's a sin, but she never denied it. Her trial was, of course, a scandal. She was trialed, topless as a humiliation, etc., etc. If you can find her story, there's a book and other things, So mostly, again, the cases I know were of men, and this is a unusual case of a woman. In terms of trans, there is a case here in Mexico, in New Spain, that's quite an interesting case, which is the Alferez nun, and I call it a case of trans identity back and forth. So Catalina was born in a privileged family in Spain, Catalina de Erauso, and the family decided she had to go to a convent. She was put in a convent, and when she was 17 or 18, I think she found boring the convent life, and so she left the convent dressed as a man and came to the Americas and fought with the Spanish crown, and fought really courageously, because Antonio, got awards, etc. Antonio was also successful with women because, from some accounts, and fighting with another man for a woman, he kills this man. So there is a trial, and Antonio is found guilty, and they decide he has to go to prison and serve a sentence. And then Antonio said, I can't go to a male prison because I am a woman, which shocks the judges. And then they create an examination board, and the board of women says, no, as a matter of fact, he is a woman. So then they decide that the sentence or the punishment is for Catalina to go back to a convent and be in a convent as a nun for several years. So she goes back to being a woman after serving some time in the convent. When she comes out, she assumes back her male identity and ends his days now as Antonio. So it's quite an interesting story. There's even a movie books, research, etc. Okay, so all of these colonies in the Americas, mostly Spanish colonies and Portuguese colonies, start to become independent in the 20th century. Sorry, in the 19th century. For this, a very bad influence was the American independence. So the first independence of the Americas is the US independence in 1776 that inspired the rest of Latin America. So you were a colony, you were sick of paying taxes to the king, you organize a war, you win, and you become independent. So that idea spread out through Latin America. Interestingly, the first country to become independent is Haiti in 1804. Sadly, still one of the poorest countries in Latin America. And little by little, they started becoming independent. Mexico becomes independent in 1821. And so then the church was taking care of this issue, and then it becomes a problem of the state. And these new nations decide to do it differently. So a lot of them, they stopped the burning people at the stake because it was too cruel. They started doing hangings, or they started doing life imprisonment or long sentences. Here, the picture on the right that I have is from one of the prisons in Mexico City in the 1920s. And they were put in a separate aisle, the J aisle. That's why in Spanish, jota or joto means bag. And so they were isolated. On one hand, they thought it was infectious, but another hand, to protect them, from some violence. And this picture, the bottom part says from a very famous writer in Mexico, Monsiváis, this fascinating pictures show us their vulnerability, but also their strength. So they look at some way empowered. So in that same century, the 19th century, in the middle, sexuality is created. So sexuality is a very recent invention. It came out as a branch from medicine, and they decided there were two conducts, heterosexuality, which was the normal conduct or behavior, and homosexuality, which the abnormal behavior or a mental illness. So with this new criteria, homosexuals were put in psychiatric hospitals. Many received electroshock therapy all the way until the 1960s. And the American Psychological Association classified it as a mental illness, like you see in this box, without research. If you want to learn more about the history of sexuality, there's a very fascinating book by Michel Foucault, The History of Sexuality. So then we're reaching the 20th century, and at the beginning of the 20th century, it was mostly considered a sin, and it was also considered a crime and a mental disorder. So we were not very welcome people. We had to hide under these three criteria, So during the 20th century, Latin America, after becoming independent, has lots of governments basically between right and left. The ones more to the left were suppressed, repressed, and I dare to say that all Latin American countries had dictators, military regimes that, as you know, repress sexuality. So some of the cases that are more iconic are, for example, Cuba. When they become communist, they persecuted homosexuals, and then they sent them to military camps to convert them, the Fidel Castro regime. Interestingly, Fidel later apologized to the homosexuals. And next in power was his brother, Raúl Castro, whose daughter, Mariela Castro, is a great activist. She's the founder of the Cuban Sexology Institute. And thanks to her, they have passed laws, and you can have your gender surgery in the Cuban health system, which is one of the best. And also, yeah, she's fought a lot for rights. They're not considering marriage because they think it's a capitalist institution. And in our system, you know, if you widow, you get a pension. And they say they don't need that because the government will protect you. So that's one example. In Chile, Dictator Pinochet persecuted homosexuals too. The military regimes of Argentina and Brazil also. And if we talk about Central America, so homosexuals were persecuted like the communists, especially in the context of the Cold War. No? So the 19th century was really challenging for LGBT people because it was not a longer a case to go to be burned at the stake, but you could go to prison, and it was not a very, there were not good times for LGBT people in the 20th century. By the middle of the 20th century, we reached the 60s, which is a rebellious time in the world, a lot in the US, and that impacts a lot Latin America. So we have all these movements, you know, all these people fighting for rights. The civil rights movement, now we know it's not over, you know, Black Lives Matter is like a new wave of this movement. The movement of agricultural workers in the US, no, Cesar Chavez as a leader. The church started by saying that we are here because of liberation theology. So the church thinking that theology also has to help the poor people, and that first world theology or European theology is very different than theology in poor countries where people are oppressed. Of course, the gay movement, we'll talk about it in a moment. The environmental movement starts, the hippie movement, which is a counterculture movement. Human rights concept starts, the left versus the right, you know, the Cold War, also very strong. Communists persecuted in the US, as you know, by the McCarthy regime. Peace movements like against the Vietnam War, the students movement in many parts of the world, and the feminist movement. No, recently I read an article that said that the greatest invention of the 20th century was the pill, because it really created a revolution in how we see sex, how we create families, etc. So a lot should still be researched about that. So all these movements had an impact in Latin America. In our case, of course, the Stonewall riots happened in New York City, and that had an impact first in the US, because next year they celebrated the first Pride in New York City, but then it just went national, and then it went international. So European cities started having Pride, and then in 1979, 10 years after Stonewall, Mexico hosts the first Pride in Latin America. So that tells you how close we are. And of course, it was very challenging, very few people. There was still persecution. And the terms are used are homosexual and lesbians, no? We're still starting to use the word gay. If we continue talking about pride, the next country to have pride in Latin America is Argentina, but it has it 2 decades later. Why? Because they had a military regime, the terrible years of repression of the dirty war. So it's until the 1992 that Argentina has the first pride. Interestingly, little by little, Argentina is at the forefront of LGBT rights, as we'll see in a moment. A few years later, Brazil has its first pride for the same reasons, because it had military regimes, dictatorships, and then Brazil in 2006 broke the world record, the Guinness World Record, with the biggest pride in the world with over 2 million people, no? So this is in terms of pride. The fight for rights for LGBT people in the world, I would say, are first against discrimination, later for civil unions or marriage, and later for trans rights. That's my criterion from some scholars. So the first fight is against discrimination. So I want to say that many countries started decriminalizing homosexuality since the 1900s, but the first country to pass an anti-discrimination law is Norway. And then in the next decade, interestingly, it's Ecuador. And Ecuador mostly because the big indigenous population. So they, in that law against discrimination, mostly for indigenous people, they included sexual orientation. But in this fight against discrimination and decriminalization, sadly, it's still a cause of death penalty and a reason for going to prison in over 60 countries. If you want to learn more about this, you should go to ILGA, International Lesbian and Gay Organization. The next battle in the world is for civil unions and later marriages. Maybe you know it, maybe not, but the first civil union happens in Denmark in 1989. This lovely couple, they're activists, the first to have a civil union. But civil unions, as you know, did not include adoption, did not include Social Security, etc. So there's need for a law that covers more, which is marriage. The first country to pass marriage is the Netherlands. And then a few years later, Spain, which is very important for Latin America because it's our mother country. So that this rights exist in Scandinavia, well, doesn't surprise us. But in Spain, a Catholic country, our mother country, but also a country that had suffered a dictatorship or repression with Franco for 40 years until the 1970s, suddenly passes marriage. It's really an inspiration for Latin America. And as a matter of fact, the first country to approve marriage 100% is Argentina in 2010. Sadly, it's still not a human right for the United Nations. So you have a right for a name, for a nationality, for an education, etc., but you still don't have the right to marry whoever you want. So that's being discussed in United Nations, but still a lot of the countries would oppose it. And I would say that the fight for transgender rights is the last wave or fight for rights. A little history is that in the 1930s, Lily L had the first reassignment surgery. You might have heard of this story with the Danish girl, a really good movie. But the first country to really recognize this legally is England or the UK. Again, Spain at the forefront in 2007, followed by Argentina, and later by Colombia. No? I'll talk about Mexico in a moment, but yeah, that now happens in Mexico. So from going global to local. So how do I do my activism? So I try to do my activism combining academia and street activism. So academia with teaching, with research. My research for my master's in history was the first visibilities of homosexuals in Mexico. So I talk about two visibilities. One is El Baile de los 41, the Ball of the 41, which was a party in the times of the dictators, surprised by the police. And then in this party, there were 42, but interestingly, one was the son-in-law of the dictator. So you can imagine the scandal. The dictator said, no, they're not 42, there's 41. They were put in prison, but of course, if they were friends of the son of the dictator, they were influential people, they were able to sort of get away with it. And we learned that this was not criminalized in Mexico. So quite a scandalous story. And interestingly, a movie was released last year, Baile de los 41, maybe. It's quite a very, very good movie. And the other visibility I researched and I talk about it is the contemporaries, which is a group of white privileged men that got away with this because they were precisely privileged white men. No? So they were painters, writers, etc. They lived openly their homosexuality. This is a drawing of the contemporaries. Also part of my activism, of course, is writing articles, giving presentations. My group, which is Grupo CD4, we had this magazine for over 30 numbers, Queer Navaca, so it raised awareness in the community. And like I said well, Carly said at the beginning, I dressed as a condom, went out in the streets to distribute condoms and brochures and go to rallies and go to demonstrations, etc. So I think there's different ways to do activism. Also going locally in Mexico, these three fights. The first one for against discrimination here in this country, in Mexico City, is always at the forefront for rights. So Mexico City was the first state of 32 to pass a law against discrimination, and this law became federal a decade later. And almost also a decade later, we modified Article 1 of the Constitution that they can't discriminate you for any reason. Among them, they wrote sexual preference. We wanted sexual orientation, but they criteria for the legislator that it's still a preference. The next battle, which is for civil unions and sex marriages in Mexico, started in 2001, the first time that civil unions were discussed, but they said it was not a priority. But 5 years later, there was approval of civil unions, again, sorry, just for Mexico City. This was not considering adoption or social security. But in the next decade, same-sex marriage passed in Mexico City in 2014. I was able to get married that year because my husband lives in Mexico City. That was already 100%, including adoption and social security. But surprisingly, 1 year later, same-sex marriage became federal in the same summer as the US. So that's quite interesting that we started our movement a little later, but in the same year, we both passed marriage. And now the challenge is that each state has to pass it. So 22 out of the 32 states in Mexico now have it. What's pending is to modify Article 4 of the Constitution that defines marriage. So you can get married, but we activists think that it would be nice to see it in our most important law. And the third struggle or battle is for transgender rights, where I think we're still way behind. Because the only place you can do your change of identity is Mexico City, with a law that passed in 2009. So there's still a lot to be done here. This law should be federal. There's still a lot of transphobia. There's still a lot of hate crimes. There should be more visibility and acceptance. There's very few gender neutral restrooms. So there's still a lot to do for transgender rights in Mexico. Going even more local in Mexico, that has 32 states. I live in the state of Morelos, in the capital, which is Cuernavaca. So Cuernavaca did not have pride. We had to go to Mexico City and march with our banner, Morelos. But in 2005, we started our first local pride, which has been, we've been having it now for 15 years. This last year was a virtual pride. So that was quite interesting, different. But yeah, so it's a city that now has pride. And my group, we started organizing a cultural week, which now is a whole month of cultural activities. So a lot has, I think I would say, been achieved. Also, Morelos is one of the few states that has a government office for sexual diversity. So not only that, but very progressively, it was even directed at some point by a transgender woman. And now the state I live in, same-sex marriages are legal. For me as a professor, what have been some of the challenges of teaching and hosting LGBT students in our study abroad programs? And maybe Carly can say a little later when we go to questions. So we worked to create an LGBT-friendly space. So we did workshops for the staff, for example, that were not used to this. We did workshops for the Spanish teachers, because as you know, Spanish is a very gendered language. So if the student was male, they would ask her, do you have a novia? If the student was a female, do you have a novio? So we said you have to use gender neutral words, pareja, etc. To give you some examples. So yeah, we had workshops with the teachers. Also with the homestays, I remember one of the workshops, and we told them, we're having LGBT students, do you want to host them? And some said, yes, of course. Then there was another group that said, we don't want to know. So something like the don't ask, don't tell policy. And there were a few families that said, no, no, no. And we asked them why, and they said, well, we have teenage kids. So again, the stereotypes that we're child molesters, etc. No? So it's been a journey, but we have, I would say, are successful in hosting LGBT students. But some of the challenges are out of our reach, like off the campus, the nightclubs they go, or we spend a week in the National University. They don't have gender neutral restrooms. So there's still some challenges. Another challenge for myself is to update myself with the US LGBT culture, since our students are from the US. So in this chart that you see here, I talked about sodomized, then the word became homosexual, then became gay, or men that have sex with men. And now, like there's all these changes, some people are using queer. There's these new identities, non-binary genders, is gendered vocabulary. Some even say that you use the word sexual dissident. So I seem to never catch up with the terminology, and Latin America is not the exception. So before we would use the @ symbol, amigos, amigas, with the @ symbol to be masculine or feminine. Now some are using amigues with an E, Latinx with an X. So it's constantly changing these things of gender. So approaching a close, I would say that in Latin America, most countries have non-discrimination laws. 1/3 of the countries in Latin America have passed marriage. So that's in some way an achievement. And some countries have passed transgender rights. Also, there's much more visibility in the media now. A lot of telenovelas now have, I would say most telenovelas have gay or lesbian stories, and Latinos, we love telenovelas, dramas, and now we can see storylines of LGBT people and some trans visibility. But the challenges for Latin America is that still mostly Catholic, and the position of the Catholic Church is not acceptance, no? The Pope, when he was bishop in Buenos Aires, he opposed really strongly against gay marriage. If you look at the declarations in the web, you'll see, like it's work of the devil and some really not very nice things. Then he went to saying, who am I to judge? Recently, he said that they have the rights to families, but then the Vatican said, well, that's his personal opinion, but that's not the stance of the Catholic Church, no? So the challenge is that many regimes, either extreme right or extreme left, don't accept it. I put this cartoon here. You can see that it's basically very similar, the left and the right in Latin America. They both don't accept, regimes. We'll see in a moment. Still, machismo is very much embedded in the culture. But interestingly, Latin America being so a machista area, Latin America has had 11 women presidents. The US does not have a woman president, but Latin America has had 11 women presidents. There are not many pictures because some have been reelected, like Michelle Bachelet in Chile, Cristina was reelected in Argentina, so that means they've done good work. Latin America sadly has high rates of crimes. Brazil and Mexico are sadly one of the highest. And also some in Latin America consider gay marriage as an imperialist imposition. So if we go back to the map that we started with, LGBT friendliness in Latin America, you can see the most friendly ones are darker in blue, of course, Argentina, followed by Brazil, by Mexico, and then yellow or in between, and less friendly in red is Central America. So, but there's a green spot in Central America, which is Costa Rica, that recently passed marriage. Bolivia is in yellow, and they're the ones that are saying, you know, that in the pre-Hispanic cultures, there were no gay couples with kids. So that's an imperialist imposition, and they do not support this, no? So I'm gonna shut up for a moment, open for questions. This is my email. Before closing, I have a great website that the name is equaldex.com, and I am going to share this again, my screen. So this is a really cool resort because Equaldex, well, there's maps of the world, and you can see also green if it's legal, where it's illegal, etc. You can see that Africa, the Middle East is really terrible. And then you can also type. So let's say we choose Ecuador. So you look at the country, and then they can tell you if it's legal, if they have marriage, gender changing, employment discrimination, military, a little history. So I think it's a really, really cool website, and it's a world website. So I really recommend you if you want to do. It has a timeline of key dates, events. It's a really cool resource. Okay, so I haven't seen the chat because I was focused on the PowerPoint, but I don't know, Carly, if there are any questions, comments so far. You can raise your hand if you prefer to voice your question.
No questions so far, but we'll give people a time to think.
Yes,
But,
yeah.
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to thank you again for sharing everything and taking your time to be with us today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Anyone can also feel free to unmute if you want to ask a question out loud. You can put it in the chat. But while people have a second to think, Antonio, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the work you do locally and how you've seen that change because of COVID, and if you're finding new ways to engage with activism, either virtually or just different ways that you're doing that.
Thank you. Well, yes, there's two ideas that come to my mind. First is that activism has changed very much to when I started in the 90s, because there was no social media. So we had other ways to organize for activism. The new generations are doing a lot of social media and Facebook and things, and I'm not so familiar with that. I'm learning. So that has changed. Also, another challenge is that it's the intergenerational aspect, you know, so the ones that started the movement in the 60s and the 70s, they're dying. And of course, they fought hard, they were persecuted, they met family, etc. Then my generation had it a little better, but the new generation, they don't, well, there's marriage, there's no discrimination, etc. And some of the activism that I did, that was AIDS education, distributing condoms, for example, same-sex workshops. Now the new generations are not taking it so seriously, you know, like, because you can get treatment, there's a vaccine around the corner. So I don't want to use the word frivolous, but I see in the young generations, they're a little more frivolous and a little more carefree because they have a lot of these things. Of course, the pandemic is a challenge everywhere. And like I said, this year, the cultural activities were online, Pride was online. So yeah, we moved to a different reality because we couldn't meet, we couldn't do things. Now I see a question here. Okay, so let's go first with the second one, and then I'll go to the first one. So how do you feel about the future of anti-discrimination activism in Latin America or Mexico specifically? So again, Mexico has federal laws against discrimination. We have a national commission against discrimination. So that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So, but we have a legal framework. I remember Martin Luther King saying, I can't make a man love him, but I can make laws that stop him from lynching me. And so, yes, yesterday was an okay day. And so creating laws is very important. Now, the thing is that people use those laws. So if you're fired from your job, evicted, or something, that you really fight and put a claim in the National Commission, Human Rights Commission. So I think that's what people still have to do. I dare to say that most Latin American countries have these laws, but of course, still there's a lot of persecution in some countries. The other question is, how would you correct the role that age plays in changing community attitudes? Do younger people to be more accepting and open about their sexualities and experiences with gender than the older generations? I was talking a little about this before this. So yes, of course, age is a factor. The older generations did not grow up with this. I mean, even myself, I never grew up with the idea that I could marry. In my teenage years, I never dreamed that I would live with a man, or even more, get married or have a family. So that had changed even for myself. There were no role models to follow. Yes, younger people tend to be more accepting. I think a difference with the US, and maybe Carly can jump and say a little, is that here, the difference between rural or urban is broader than in the US. So in the US, like, you go to rural areas and you have good high schools, junior high schools, and people are connected with internet, etc. So they're, I would say, a little more open-minded. Whereas in Mexico, you go to rural areas and the families are still big, 4, 5, 6 kids. In urban areas, there are 2, 3. And the educational gap is really broad, like the urban middle class educated in the cities, very different than the rural areas where people still don't further their education, et cetera, women don't have opportunities. So I would say that that's the difference, in Mexico, more rural versus urban. And also, again, Mexico City, like an island in the center of the country, where you have marriage, the transgender law, abortion, euthanasia, rights for animals, etc. And then the rest of the country, that we don't have all these rights. Abortion, the only place is Mexico City, for example. Another question here, it says, was there a significant difference in how difficult it was for female versus male members of the LGBT community in gaining acceptance and rights in Latin America? Very good question, because in 2003, the lesbians decided to do their own pride in Mexico City, because the pride in Mexico City, they thought it was just organized by men, that they were machistas, that it was a party and there was still, we had to fight for rights. So they did a march, the lesbian march, in the month of March, close to International Women's Day, March 8th, because they thought that there would still have to fight, the pride had to be more political. So yes, there is more gay privilege than lesbian privilege or trans privilege. And that's been a challenge in the LGBT groups, in the LGBT communities, and organizations. Another question here is, have you found distinct differences in the labels used by members of the LGBT community from the United States and from Latin America? Yes, yes, of course. So for example, the term queer, that's quite common in the US. Here in Latin America, it's still not very, very used. We understand it mostly if you're educated, but that's the difference. All these new identities that I put in the PowerPoint, you know, the non-binary, gender, cisgender, I would say very few people use these labels in terms of vocabulary. For example, the pronouns, you know, I see my students have it in their soon after their name and their emails. Very few people do that in Mexico. And these new identities, very few people tell you about these identities. Younger generations, of course, more. So yeah, there's difference in the labels, in the use of pronouns. And I dare to say Mexico is close to the United States, so we're more closer, not geographically, but also culturally. But I dare to say that South America are even farther from the US culturally.
Thanks to everyone for the questions. I can go off what Antonio said a little bit about the rural versus urban divide. Whereas here in the United States, for most of you who are Gettysburg students, we consider Gettysburg rural because it's small, there's a lot of farms around, but that's nothing like what rural is in Mexico. So here, a lot of people in rural areas, we tend to, I think in the United States, we tend to make rural synonymous with conservative, which to an extent is true. Whereas in Mexico, at least when I was there, rural just meant you didn't have as much access to information, either because of like there wasn't internet available or there was less communication. So I think in that way, it holds back how things can change. And the other thing that Antonio mentioned is just gendered language. Spanish is everything is gendered. Pronouns, the adjectives that come after them. So while there is some progress, there's a big barrier just in the language itself that doesn't exist in English. And as far as labels, again, like Antonio said, like sometimes they just don't translate between both. So while the US might make some progress, it doesn't always translate back to Spanish. But as far as the students, when I was there in homestays, one student that I went with I went to Westchester, who was trans, he stayed with his host family, and his host family was very welcoming to him. He never had any issues. Sometimes he had odd interactions like in public or at his internship. But again, it is a barrier that I think Antonio and the rest of the CGEE staff do well to address and to acknowledge. But Antonio, you have another question in the chat.
Yes, let me see. So it was part of the previous question, follow-up question. Do you think the general nature of Spanish can contribute to the lack of discussion around gender fluidity? Yes, I agree with that. I also typed in the chat that the legacy of colonialism is still very present because the highest authority in terms of Spanish is the Royal Spanish Academy. No? Like in English, the highest authority is England. By the way, there's a very good movie about the story of the Oxford Dictionary, which I think is called the Scientist and the Madman or something like that. So when they started doing the Oxford Dictionary, they put an ad in the London Times and you could submit your entries. And this guy sent words every day with their definitions perfectly. So when the guy finishes the dictionary, wants to go and give a copy, of the book to this person that helped. Actually, it's the first volume. And when he looks for this man, he's in the psychiatric ward. It's a really good movie with Sean Penn, and I really recommend it. So part of the legacy of colonialism, it's that still Spain is the highest authority, and the Royal Spanish Academy is the highest authority. So they decide what words are new or accepted, etc. There's a lot of words related to technology, for example, that become verbs, like textear, forwardear, whatsappear. So all these things we're now using become verbs, and they have to accept it even if they don't like it. But they're also the highest authority in terms of gender and sexuality. For example, and I'm typing here, the correct word, because I talked about women in power, is la presidente. So women insist that president should be a female word, presidenta with an A, but the Spanish Language Academy says no. The gender goes in the article, no? But women insist it has to be president. In some cases, they finally accept it because that's what people use. But again, they're the ones that decide what new words are put there. If you remember the history of the politically correct words, so words related to gender were all changed, like postman, male courier, mailman, firefighter, fireman, firefighter. So the word man was taken out of it because they're women doing that professions. In Spanish, I would say there's a similar movement, but then what changes is the article, no? So there's cultural differences, language differences, but again, we're subject to the highest authority, which is in Spain. Okay, there is another question. To follow up on the urban-rural divide, do you believe the current lack of access to information means everyone living in the rural area is not open to different identities or orientations, or are some people from rural areas still open to at least learn? Okay, yes, another very, very, very good question, because yes, part of why LGBT peoples have thrived in cities is because you can be anonymous. So you go to a big city and you can be a lot what you want. But if you live in rural areas, you don't dare to come out of the closet, everybody's gonna find out. And so, but there are exceptions, and maybe Carly remembers, but we do a rural homestay in rural areas. And yeah, there's trans people that live there dressed as a woman and are comfortable with their identity. A very interesting case, and you can do some research, are the Muxes in Oaxaca. So the Muxes in Oaxaca, in the Isthmus, they dress like a woman, they're accepted, and they take care of their elder parents. They also initiate men sexually because there's no risk of pregnancy, for example, but they're really accepted. So it's quite an interesting story. There's a lot of YouTube videos, a lot of research in Oaxaca. But that's not all indigenous communities or rural areas, no? So for some, these identities are new, they're alien. There is also a very interesting thing in this country, which are the Zapatistas. So quickly, the Zapatista uprising happened in '94, a group of indigenous people in Chiapas that were declared the war to the Mexican state. the war to neoliberalism. They wanted to live very much the pre-Hispanic ways of living, communal ways of living. After 30 years, there is a new generation born in that new framework. And so they don't, they have their own health care, they have their own education, they have their own legal system. So it's like a little country within Mexico. And of course, they're very open, non-discriminatory, etc. But not to all these identities. On their speeches, they do say, you know, they welcome anybody, un mundo que quepan muchos mundos, a world where everybody fits in. But I've been there, and you don't see gay couples, lesbian couples. So it's part, like what I said at the end of my presentation, that in pre-Hispanic cultures, there were no gay families, gay lesbian couples with kids, you know, that's an imperialist imposition. So some indigenous people see this as an imposition, these new identities.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes.
About so the idea of machismo that stems from factors of toxic masculinity, right? And so we still see this like toxic masculinity and still this machismo with men who identify in LGBT community, right? Is there any like talk about that and like among activists about how, you know, that privilege that maybe can be considered in a way a privilege that gay men have that, for example, transgender women don't have?
Mm-hmm. So like in general in society, yes, this is a very machista country, again, imposed by the Spanish. Just to give you an example, but in Spain, the crown is just passed to men. A woman can't be a queen. So their system, of course, is very machista. They imposed here. And if you look at Mexican history, well, we hadn't had a woman president. We have very few legislators, governors, although there is a 50% quota that all candidates should be feminine, etc. But yeah, so in the public domain, you know, it's mostly ruled by men and white men. And then if you go to the LGBT groups, like I said, yes, there's this gay privilege, male privilege. So men are the organizers of pride. And yeah, the trans people are the ones that are fired more from jobs. They don't find the jobs. They're discriminated. They're evicted. They're beaten. So yeah, within the LGBT acronyms, I would say the trans are at the bottom. Lesbians have also less privilege for being women. And if you talk within gays, you know, like the more masculine you are, you have more privilege than the effeminate gays. So yeah, within the LGBT community, there is, of course, machismo. Yes.
Thank you.
We still have some time if anyone else has any questions.
Yes, questions or comments, of course, or specific. I don't know, I'm not the expert at a specific country you want to hear about. For example, I was thinking in Nicaragua. Nicaragua has Daniel Ortega after the revolution, after the Sandinistas, and you would say, you know, like these revolutions are progressive, but he's really conservative. He's opposing abortions, same-sex marriages, etc. And they have elections next year, but the left is divided, so surely he's going to stay in power. So there's no hope for not only LGBT rights, but sexual and reproductive rights in Nicaragua, because they have a very repressive regime. So that'll maybe take a decade to get rights in Nicaragua, to give you an example. No other countries in Central America, like Salvador or Honduras, have already modified their constitution that marriage is between a man and a woman. So as long as the Congress doesn't have more progressive legislators, they won't be able to have same-sex marriages. So for some countries, it's still a challenge in Latin America.
Antonio, could you speak a bit to why, if you know, why Paraguay is more red on that map that you showed us at the end? Because it seems like the red was really concentrated in Central.
See, I thought Bolivia would be redder than Paraguay. Yeah. What I do know is that Paraguay had a dictator, Stroessner, that really did like witch hunts or gay hunts, you know, really persecuted homosexuals. They would go to prison. They were very repressive. And you don't hear much about Paraguay's legislation, etc. So yeah, I was surprised to see Paraguay not as progressive as Bolivia, because Bolivia, again, they don't support gay marriage, for example. But I guess it's because of this repression under the dictatorship with Stroessner, and that maybe they still haven't passed all these progressive laws.
I have one more question. It also relates to machismo. So do you think, well, obviously through education, like machismo can be like, but can this really be abolished? Like this idea that is so like embedded from like, you know, history and religion, like across Latin America, because, you know, in a bunch of families, a lot of LGBTQ teens growing up end up committing suicide, you know, going through a lot of mental issues, like not being accepted, like the fear of not being accepted in their family due to the stereotype of machismo and how a man and a woman should act and what they should be attracted to. So over time, can that be abolished? Or is that like really?
Well, that's, if you have heard of Judith Butler, who has this amazing book, Gender Trouble and Gender Theory, you know, she said that gender is constructed and can be deconstructed. So if you learn that you have to act a certain way as a man, you can change that. So that's the hope for feminists. I would say that in the US, the big issue is race right now. And here in Mexico, the big issue is gender or feminicides. So last year in March, International Women's Day, March 8th, there was a demonstration that got so violent, you know, like the images you see of the states of Minneapolis, of Black Lives Matter, all this. You would see that in Mexico, but there were women, you know, that were fed up that there's no persecution of feminicides, that they're treated really bad if they're raped, that they don't have abortion, etc. So there were marches throughout last year, and they got very violent because, again, women are really, really, really mad at young women. And so this is, of course, also against machismo. The sad thing, I think, was that in these marches, they could police women. And you would see this young, I don't know if they're feminists or not, but like beating police women. And you would think there's some gender fraternity, sorority, but no, you know, they're so mad against authority, the establishment. So I think here the struggle right now is young women that, yeah, they're fed up of the feminicides, not having abortion nationally, etc. So there is still a lot to be done in that area. Another question, do you think the laws of a country always reflect the attitudes of people given the history of military dictatorship? Another good questions. Well, yeah, laws reflect if the citizens fight for some laws, but if not, the government reflects what their position or their stance is. And you know, in military regimes, you know, you don't question people, you know, what do you want? You know, you impose things. So yeah, another thing I wanted to say and talk about is our current president. So you probably know that our current president is López Obrador. He's from the left. It's the first time in Mexican history that we've been ruled by the left. So we've always ruled by the vice king. Then we had presidents, monarchs, etc. And then we had a dictatorship party from the extreme right. PRI, another one, which is PAN, extreme right. So finally in Mexican history, as of 2018, we were ruled by the left. You would think the left is more open, more progressive. López Obrador was mayor of Mexico City, and he was mayor of Mexico City. He did not support abortion. He did not support same-sex marriages. As a matter of fact, he said there should be a referendum. And we activists said, you know, like, you don't put human rights to referendum. So he's not supportive of these issues being from the left. So yeah, not necessarily being on the left means that you're progressive, that you are accepting, and this president is not the exception, no? So it's challenging because, again, the pandemic. So a lot of the things he wanted to do, he has not been able to do it because all the money has to go to the pandemic. So also controversial, it's because, for example, he went to visit Trump and Mexicans saw him as a traitor because of the terrible comments that Trump has done towards Mexicans. And still, you know, he goes and sort of backs him before the election. So a lot of people didn't like this stance. I would say that he's still very popular by the poor people, the rich, the wealthy. The media don't like him at all. Feminists, LGBT people, we don't like him because he have not supported these issues. So yeah, we have a controversial president right now in Mexico.
Just to add on to that about the president and him being controversial, it was definitely a space for empathy when I was studying abroad because I was there in 2018, math. But either way, so I came right after López Obrador was elected and right in the middle of Trump's presidency here. And I had a lot of good discussions with my host family about politics. They wanted to know all about the system, how it works in America. I wanted to understand how it worked here. So we talked a lot about how there's a lot of space for empathy and understanding and having a president that doesn't necessarily represent the views of a lot of people. So, and there was some understanding for like between our two countries in that way.
Yeah, and some things are very obvious. You know, there were more rights for LGBT people with Clinton, with Obama, less with Reagan, less with Trump. But also social movements have inertia. So they're so strong that some things pass despite extreme right governments or extreme right presidents. So a lot of these laws have passed, at least in Mexico, in times of extreme right governments. Sadly, for example, the Catholic Church is still really, really conservative. Our local bishop, for example, recently said that the pandemic was God's punishment for same-sex marriages, abortion, trans people, and naming all these things. And so, like, that's terrible that this, like the times of the Inquisition, you know, this bishop telling you that God is punishing you for all these things. And so there's very few progressive voices in Mexico. One voice that gives me hope within Mexico I'm typing it. It's the Bishop Raul Vera. So Bishop Raul Vera is from the north, and he openly supports same-sex marriages. He has baptized children that I know of lesbian and gay couples. He's done religious private Sarah blessings. But he's, I guess, the only bishop that supports this, but the rest of the hierarchy, the Catholic, does not support this. So yeah, the challenges here are still very much the Catholic Church. In terms of laws, we have a lot of laws. Governments now have to follow, because if there's a law, they have to marry you. So even though there's an extreme right government, they have to keep up with this, and it's not well seen that you discriminate. I think that's what's being helpful. And machismo, well, culture takes a while to change, to educate people.
As we come to an end with our time with Antonio, do we have any final thoughts or questions? Well, we'd like to take the time to thank you all for participating in today's discussion, and we also like to thank Antonio for sharing his story and expertise with us today, as well as Carly for facilitating our conversation. Tomorrow we are excited to have our partners from Morocco joining us in a session titled Muslim Moroccan Women: Perspectives Across Generations. We hope to see many of you once again tomorrow. Have a great rest of the day, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Carly. It's good to see you again, and I appreciate very much all your patience, your very thoughtful questions. My pleasure really to collaborate with Gettysburg, and I praise that your university presents these issues that I think are important for people to know. Gracias, gracias.